All right. If everybody's ready, I think we got enough folks and we are off and running. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I think that you'll be very much so involved. I think the conversation will be enlightening. My name is Fredrick Douglass Dixon, only Dixon on payday. So, every day other than that, I'm Fredrick Douglass. So, we have a group of people here to discuss a very serious topic in a way that is bound and doomed to widen and stretch, add to, inject esoteric information into the mainstream narrative. So I want to go through and make sure you know who everybody here is that is with us. You see Ben Herdt. Ben Herdt here is from the University of Wyoming ACES. He's the supervisor of the advisors. And Ben and I have been working together now for the last year, close to the last year. And we just completed a 4-week critical conversation on having a very intense and in-depth examination of white privilege, white supremacy, patriotism, racism with white men as a focus group. Very good to have that conversation. It worked out very well, which leads us to want to do more work like that. So we're still in the planning stages of what we would do next. But that in itself, to have that conversation, much needed. I think it went very well. So thank you, Ben, for being here. Next, we have Mr. Todd Byrd, a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist and professional that I've known for years. And I think that his insight when it comes to this, you know, when I asked him to be a part of it, I was just hoping he would say yeah, because he's never said no to me about something like this yet. But the idea is to hear these thoughts from even in the professional sense, more so in the professional realm, those folks who have had these experiences and will explain them to you and kind of how we get to where we are right now. So we thank him for coming as well. I hope you guys can see Toby Thompson. He's our tech guy, and he has been working with me for the past 2 years. And to have him here at the University of Wyoming, he helps everything that the Black Study Center does. So we thank you. And then we have Dr. Venus Evans Winters from Chicago, originally now working with a great think tank and a policy creating company out of the Bloomington, Illinois area. She was here in 2020 and gave the keynote speech here at the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Conference. So we thank her, Black History Month Conference. We thank her for coming. And then next we have Dr. Perry Benson. Dr. Perry Benson is a professor at College of Lake County in the corner of the northwest suburbs of Illinois. He's also a graduate, PhD graduate from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and a advocate and a community developer. So we thank him for being here. And then I can't see, but I know we have Sister Faith Bynoe here, who is a strategist. She holds so many different titles, but one of the titles is that she's a healer. So we thank her for coming. And I want to kind of get started on our topic tonight. Our topic tonight is allyship, white privilege, and social justice racism. So when we start with those terms, I think it's more than apropos that we have functional definitions for each one of those terms, what it looks like, what it's going to look like tonight, and then how we move forward. But just think about it. Think about this topic. Allyship, white privilege, and social justice racism. There are many people who saw our promotional poster across the world. And there are many people here in Laramie, Wyoming, particularly at the University of Wyoming, who may have become angered because we're going to have this conversation. Well, as the director of the Black Study Center, that's what we're here for. We're here to extend the dominant narrative. We're here to challenge those things that are dictum or so-called dictum, those things that uphold the status quo and talk about the layered nuances in them. So I think in many ways, we have a great conversation lined up. And for everybody who's with us, Feel free to use the chat. Toby will be DJing, if you will. He will be the person who will move us from side to side. So feel free to leave your comments, your concerns, and your questions in the chat. And I think we're off and running. As I was always taught, ladies first. So when we think about allyship, Dr. Evans Winters, how do individuals define allyship?
Well, thanks for starting with me.
Oh, absolutely.
So how is allyship defined? You know, it's interesting because even when I posted this conversation across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, I told my audience, my friends, my family, colleagues, that I've always struggled with the term allyship. In particular, let's just call it white allyship because that's who we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And we're thinking about, you know, white people being an ally to whom and to what. And so when I posted this even on Instagram, I said, look, y'all know I'm not used to this type of conversation, but I'm here for the dialogue. I'm here to listen. I'm a skeptic because I'm not sure that those of us who are part of the, the African community, the African centered community, we have to define what's our struggle. And I think we know our struggle, but do we need friends right now, right? Or do we need people who are willing to tear stuff up with us, dismantle things with us, people who are willing to give up some of their power and their privilege to redistribute power, redistribute wealth, rethink our ideas, our conceptualizations of what liberation looks like for whom and for what at what time. And I'm not sure that we need friends right now. We need people who are ready to go to war.
Well said. That takes us to Faith. Sister Faith, if you could give us your thoughts on the challenges of defining allyship, and let's be very direct, white allyship when it comes to Blacks in a contemporary society as we know it today, as violent as it is towards Blacks.
Sure, I think, so white allyship is, it challenges us to understand how white folks can move through their privilege to get to a point in which they can actually meet us in a place that they can actually do work, which I would challenge that Sister Garza has said is not allyship. It is being a co-conspirator. And so when we think about what it means in terms of allyship, the adoption of an idea without actually having skin in the game, that in and of itself serves no one, doesn't even serve those white folks who call themselves allies, because it is just rhetoric. And so what does it mean for them to say, how do I actually participate? If I am actually interested in leveling the table in an equitable way, not equal, but equitable way, what do I have to do actively to participate in, to be able to say, I am walking with people because I recognize, I acknowledge, and not just with lip service, but with my behavior, with my investments, that there needs to be a change and I am part of that change.
Thank you so much. Very well said. How about we go to Ben? Ben, and we thank you for being here. And the idea of inviting many different voices is to hear it directly. And I think that one thing that Ben has proven, particularly to me, is that he wants to have the conversation and he also wants things to change. So Ben, when you talk about white allyship and you and I do what they consider social justice development advocacy, what do you see your role as?
Yeah, so first, thank you, Professor Dixon, for including me in this conversation. And I wanted to touch on a couple of those topics that came up. Professor Dixon and I look at dictionary definitions a lot and what is in language. And so that the allyship relates to war, right? If you look up a dictionary definition, so I appreciate that, Dr. Venus, that you brought that into the play, because you have to have skin in the game. And Professor Dixon and I have talked about this from my perspective, where I am right now. I've recognized that you can't just declare allyship, right? What you can do maybe as a white person is you can sympathize. But that's like Faith said, I mean, you got to put some skin in the game. And so once you do that, and I think again, from my perspective, it's got to be through your action and through the relationships and connections that you've built, where you might reach a place where somebody considers you an ally. But I don't think that consideration can come from yourself. And I think that that's a big thing. People want to declare their allyship. White people want to declare their allyship as a sign, like, hey, I'm on your side. But I don't think, I think that has to be challenged. And I think it has to be, well, what are you doing, right? And so you can sympathize as a white person, but to truly be an ally, you have to go beyond that. I mean, you can advocate, but to be an ally, you have to go beyond that. And what does that look like? I mean, we have to continue investigating that.
Okay, well, thank you. Todd, can we go right to you, and we'll go directly to Perry after that, and then we'll go in reverse order. But Todd, when you think about white allyship in today's contemporary society, your thoughts?
My thoughts are definitely not as scholarly, but what I would say is pretty much in line with what the panelists have already said. And it's just that, how can you align yourself to help us accomplish our goal? And oftentimes it doesn't include us. And so allyship, I say, just try humanity. You know, it's showing some compassion, and actually, again, don't mean to be, I don't mean to just over extend it, but basically what it is just, what are we doing about it? I mean, you can feel some type of way, and that emotion can be very fleeting, but allyship, again, going back to what Ben says, implies pick a side. It implies adversarial relationships when you have to pick. So yeah, that's about it.
Okay, all right. Perry, if you could continue that conversation with your thoughts.
All right, thank you indeed, and good evening. Allyship.
Good evening.
And I think it's an opportunity for camaraderie or for some support for those who want to be a source of support in their own way. And as has been stated before, me finding exactly what their way needs to be, what it should be, and what actually yields some real allyship, if you will, to be truly to the word, that has to be explored by each individual person. So those are my thoughts, comments on allyship.
Okay, so when I think about allyship, the problem that I want to put forth with the term allyship, and I mean problematic in a very serious way and sincere way, is a lot of times with allyship to a critical mass of whites, particularly professionals, that means power. That means to lead. So I want to stop right there and go into just a bit of the history to kind of look at it so that we lay it out in a different kind of way. So we can't trivialize our conversation here and not recognize the very important way that we need to center this discussion about the ubiquitous control of white liberals over Black progressive organizations. Is anybody with me? So I'll use it just like this and say that the NAACP as an organization, as a point of reference, as early as 1909, with the poster boy being Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Very brilliant man. But then we think about the real control of the NAACP, and one name that I hope that you'll get from this and take this down. If we're in class, I would say take notes, but I would like for you to recognize the idea of Joel Spingarn. I'm sure the Spingarn name means something to Faith, because Faith is a Howard grad. When we talk about Joel Spingarn was the board chairman of NAACP in 1915, same year that we saw Birth of a Nation. And he served as president from 1929 to 1939. So he has this influence as a leader and the leadership of the NAACP. But make it clear, as he was driving force in the leadership of how the NAACP will be sculpted, the idea was never to have Blacks pay attention to their economic situation, pay more attention to the social issues and break down those barriers. So from the very beginning, when we talk about one of our longest standing organizations, we need to understand that allyship in itself has been a very nefarious level that we find on a regular basis that continues to set the pace for like the Urban League. So when people talk about things like, you know, the March on Washington, the Big Six, that was controlled by white philanthropy. So a lot of times when we talk about allyship, it ties to philanthropy, which gives ultimate control. So when we think about social justice racism. Let's put it in the form of looking at who controls social justice. So Perry, you went last. How about you go first and we go the other way?
All right, thank you so much again. It's a lot there, right? Again, we talk about a lot in context. We talking about 100-year plus of relationships, decisions, and all of these different dynamics that brother Dr. Dixon mentioned, right? Power dynamics are constantly there, right? I heard the term, we're talking about the role and the presence and the participation, right? And the influence of white liberal, right? And that thinking and that mindset, who often are in leadership roles, right? Who often are in positions of power, right? And privilege. And then there are us, right? So many of us that are there. So a lot of the times, right? Many of us, and historically, right, and into the present, we're in a situation where you have folk, some, right, many absolutely mean well. Some don't even understand exactly what they're doing or don't understand the offense or the way that they're causing more problems, right? Or that they continue to perpetuate some of the systemic racist things. Again, so I'll give this quick example of somebody that means well, right? You see somebody walking out in the street and you want to stop them from getting hit by a car, you run out and try to push them out the way, but you push them into a truck. So sometimes that happens, right? So with that, I'm gonna yield the floor as Brother Dixon.
Okay, I love it because I think being practical is what we need now. I think what Dr. Perry is saying, and I agree in this way, that there is a difference between a kind person and a kind act. And I think if we separate those two, we begin to flesh out the idea of what white allyship means. In many regards, white allyship, when it comes to control of Black thought and Black progress, means don't go too far, which means in many ways the intoxication of gradualism. So Todd, you went, and we're going in the reverse order, so feel free.
I think the media plays a large part in who controls social justice, because by being perpetuated through media, if we look back in history, and the way that they depicted different groups, that in and of itself created a mindset of people. And to some degree, it particularly dehumanized us as Black African-American people, Native American people, and people from other marginalized communities. And so to me, I mean, the media right now, I mean, the reason why the social justice is so big because how much is being played and portrayed in the media, but we need to be careful in terms of how they're controlling the narrative. And so to me, we really do need to be mindful and take a step, going back to what Dr. Perry says, starts with ourselves, but not so much as us as a people to impose the ideals on human beings that we should treat other human beings as human beings. And so to me, I think we really need to take a close look. And I think this dialogue that you bring to bear is going to shed some light on that.
I think I thank you, Todd, but I think one way that we look at this is a very serious manner that we give a critique. I think when you write, you know, Dr. Venus, folks give a critique. When you lead, folks give a critique. And I think today is a great time to give a critique of who controls social justice. That's the gist of it. Ben, you guys, we wanted to go right back to you.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head. Is who controls it and where does it come from and what lens is it being crafted from? And so for me, it's all coming from the same institutional lens that created institutional racism. And we have to go back, and it has to stem from history. We have to look back. We have to see where it's coming from the past 400 years from the creation of the idea of whiteness in America until now. And then look at who's leading the educational efforts, not just in social justice, but within our educational system. Because I think it's a slippery slope when we talk about social justice and assimilation. And that's not it. True social justice wouldn't be assimilating to this narrative. It would be really, really true social justice, which is truth, which means we need to look back and see what the history is and what has built this model that needs to change. And so for me, I really look at the educators who are educating the youth in America, and what sort of training are they receiving, and what's that coming from? Because if it isn't different, then it's just going to perpetuate the same thing.
Well, I agree. I think that when we think about those who control formal education, and we can all use higher education as an example, then, you know, there is this illusionary perception that in higher education, that when we talk about academic freedom is real. I think this is the closest thing that I've seen to academic freedom having this conversation, which doesn't mean we won't have pushback, which doesn't mean we won't have folks who will go directly at this and saying this conversation is divisive. Because that's privilege, to be able to counteract a direct conversation with saying reverse racism, if you will, just as an understanding. So Faith, when we continue, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And first of all, Faith, did you hear how I kind of injected the idea of Joel Spingarn into this conversation?
You did. And I also want to thank you for interjecting the sector of philanthropy, because in a previous life, that is everything that I did as a grant maker.
That's why I brought it up.
I know you did, and I appreciate that little softball to me, right?
Absolutely.
Because first off, the work of race is hard. It has always been difficult for people of color to live through and to experience and to be able to articulate for ourselves, locate ourselves within the chaos that racial inequity and structural inequities bring to us. So if, as a white ally, you are not uncomfortable, you are not doing the work. You cannot sit in your ease, say that you are doing something, and in turn, and that doing something may very well be that you're identifying resources that you want to give out. But as someone who gave out the money in very large institutions, there are a growing, but when I was there about 15 years ago, a smaller group of people of color who are invested in ensuring that resources are given out and distributed in a way that is smart, strategic, and equitable to move the agenda of equity forward. And the challenge within the sector itself were white folks who called themselves allies, who were not okay with being in their discomfort. They wanted to take an old model, that which the Rockefellers and the Fords, the charitable model, not philanthropy, the love of philanthropy, afforded to do the kind of hard work in which they are now being challenged. So the two things that I want to lead with is, one, as a white ally, you still have to do the hard work. And two, as we talk about this work of social equity, racial equity within philanthropy, there are already some white folks who are co-conspirators. So look to them as a model and listen to their stories about the hard work that they did to actually become an ally or co-conspirator, and ask the people of color who are funding the activists who are enacting these kind of ripple effects within our country, what it means to actually have people who offer up resources, what it means to actually have them embody true allyship and being a true co-conspirator.
Well, I thank you, and I just kind of want to finish up on Mr. Spingarn himself, Faith. Readily available that the record reflects he was an agent with the Military Intelligence Bureau. And for years, this is the man with the NAACP for the most part. He was charged with infiltrating, charged with reporting back on this discomfort that was going through the NAACP about just being about social justice, if you will, or social issues. So in many ways, he's been pointed out as one who worked with the most clandestine intelligence agencies in America, but while he controlled one of America's, long-lasting agencies that eventually turned into this legal organization that dedicated to changing social justice reform during the civil rights movement before and after it, as far as the legality goes, de jure. So when we think about that as a backdrop, there's a significant portion of modalities within social justice that are controlled by liberal whites. And a critical mass of those whites feel entitled to control. So let's go to the identity. Let's go to the psycho-viscera that would have a person like on this campus up until 2 days ago, who was a white anthropologist, a geologist, who thought that he should be leading the Black Lives Matter committee. Now, isn't it kind of timely that he's no longer that now? So I think the continuous idea of having these conversations in public has not necessarily led to a person who is capitulating, but just doesn't want to deal with this conversation this way. And I know Dr. Venus is in the middle of philanthropy. She's in the middle of policy creation. So when you think about the control, Dr. Venus, and the philanthropy and social justice where it is now, not where it started, but where it is now, if you could give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is we've already been compromised. We've been compromised, right? We're literally on Facebook Live. So this
Absolutely.
is the one corporation that has intentionally disrupted, Black activism using digital technology.
Absolutely.
This is the one corporation, as we smile, because I just want to make sure they have my pearly whites. They've already tracked me down. But this is the one organ. Yeah, they already tracking us. This is the one organization that has put millions, if not billions of dollars behind surveillance technology that actually reproduces itself, meaning that it brings back more capital. So not only are they possibly, and I'm sure Toby can speak to this better than any of us can, not only are they going to block who actually see this broadcast. So they might block so-called white people who might actually have the mindsets and the mentality to learn from this conversation. They may block Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks who decide this is where I want to be today because I can learn. But they also might block us and start surveillancing our technology. But what's interesting, not only this blocking and this intervention of justice work, but also this intentional advertising back to us these various political messages. And they're going to capitalize off of it in different ways, right? And so with that said, now that we know that we've been compromised, before we can even talk about any type of revolutionary acts that are meaningful, we have to have conversations around distribution of wealth, in particular, the redistribution of wealth. And so some of these so-called philanthropists that we're talking about, let's name it. We're talking about white philanthropists, and we have our big five. It's not like we have our big 100,000. And then when we look at those big five, it's not like they giving away money like they making it rain up in here. Let's be clear, they're not. They're giving us their penance, their crumbs. I learned something from Grant Makers for Girls. And what they do is they fund nonprofit and racial and gender justice work for girls of color across the United States. And I learned looking at one of their newsletters that a lot of this philanthropy funding, actually approximately 2% of funding goes to women of color and organizations of color. And are you like, that blows you away? So sometimes we're uplifting and we're praising, again, just we're getting crumbs off that table. We're getting crumbs off that table, and we have to stop settling. So where racial justice co-conspiratorship starts? It starts with, yes, funding the revolution, but it also starts with dismantling the nonprofit industrial complex. It's also about rethinking how we fund so-called philanthropic work or social justice work, right? And also it's about this disinvesting in white supremacist institutions. So we never talk about that flip side of it. We can keep giving money to say, hey, Dr. Dixon, we know that you're already tired. We know that you're already overworked. We know that you're serving more of the students of color than any other faculty. But guess what? We're gonna give you some more money to do that work. But there's only 24 hours in a day and 7 days in the week. You see what I'm saying? So even if we talk about redistribution, we also have to talk about disinvestment. And so now when I think about that too, I think about the ways in which we're tied. Not only are we sucking at the udders of white supremacy, but we're tied to capitalism. the one thing that made us property in this country, we think that's going to be the other thing that save us, because some of these philanthropist groups, some of these investors, they're not investing in whole movements, they investing in individuals. Let's keep it real. You can open up any site now, and we're all at risk when you're investing in the individual and their cause, as opposed to entire movements and organizations and systems and institutions.
Yep.
Not progressive.
Very well said.
We've actually rolled back since the NAACP began.
That's the truth. That is absolutely the truth, which many other things too, like integration, if you will. We look at it in many different ways, but I believe that it's more segregated now in public schools than it ever has been. And we understand that. So to make sure that we want to put this on the table, this is the perfect time. Inject the term social justice racism. Now, I once heard that from a very wise friend of mine. He said social justice racist. So it's been about, since the beginning of the school year, I've been injected it into small conversations among colleagues. And, I go right at some of them because of their privilege. And I inject the term social justice racism. So when we think about the term social justice racism, we understand racism is a part of every system in America and across the globe. So what does it mean when you hear that term, social justice racism? Sister Faith, go ahead.
To me, it means that it is people falling back into the patterns that they know. How do we co-opt belief systems that there is some energy, some traction, that there are people who are placed that are working hard to do some transformative work, but because of our own personal discomfort, we want to take it and assume it so that we don't have to do the work.
What kind of mentality does that represent, Faith?
And so that's what and by the we, I am not talking about the we of the people of color. I really am talking about our white counterparts who are uncomfortable with their privilege, are uncomfortable with their fragility. What does it mean to be, the moment you're actually talking about authentic transformative work, if you're going to do the work of justice, there's the transformative work that you have to do for yourself. And that takes time and investment. And if you are uncomfortable in moving through the discomfort, fearful of that hard work, you will try to consume in a way that you can co-opt a whole framework around what social justice could be. So then it becomes social justice light, which is why there may have been in the beginning some teeth for a few people around allyship, the original term of allyship, in which they may have actually meant, and I don't know, in some ways this is a general statement, right? But there may have been a percentage of people who really wanted to meet folks where they were to get work done. But the truth is, the larger group of people who aren't ready to do the kind of hard transformative work could take that and co-opt it so that you could have whole corporations say, okay, we put up our Black Lives Matter moniker, but we haven't actually done the kinds of investments and transformative work within our institutions. So what that meant was that they were called out to actually begin to hold, for people to begin to hold each other accountable. So when I talk about, because I continue to talk about what it means to be a co-conspirator, and I see the questions that are coming up, don't like decide, okay, so let me drop the word and term allyship and use co-conspirator. I think, Ben, you pointed it out really well. You cannot anoint yourself to be an ally nor a co-conspirator. Do the hard work. And if someone says to you, that looks like, that's starting to smell like, that's starting to feel a little bit like allyship, not even yet to be co-conspirator, right? Do the hard work so that you aren't trying to co-opt ideas and terms, because we had to move away from the term ally to identify a way in which we could define ways in which people could meet us to do this hard work.
Okay. And as Faith was saying, we want you to keep coming with the questions, which we will get to in our question and answer session, but it means a lot. for us to have your thoughts so we can develop these conversations. And when I think about social justice racism or social justice racist, the one thing that comes to my mind is this relative individuality that allows for you, I mean, particularly with a person who has a position of power that ties to funding, that ties to the ability to impact conversation because of their position. So when I think about that, I think about the old adage that when the shoe squeezes on your toe. With a social justice racist, in many ways, in many thoughts, they are very progressive in many parts of their life, but when it comes to race. So when we think about someone with a position of power of, let's say, a white person who's over something like Black Lives Matter, they'll begin to craft that narrative to do what? To be able to fall in line with what they think is important, but they'll draw the line when it points right at them. So it becomes very interesting with a social justice racist with a position that ties directly to diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice racist. And that's where I give it to you, Dr. Perry. What's your thoughts on that?
So, and thank you, brother. As I think about it, what I think my thoughts are, we got plenty of work to do, right? So for those who are listening, right, again, if you consider yourself an ally, if you're sympathetic or empathetic and you want to do something for this movement, right, for these causes, I heard our sister Faith say, well, you got to start with yourself, right? You really got to do some soul searching with yourself first, right, to get to that point. As our brother stated, and I think about this, I have sat probably in one too many meetings where someone is facilitating a meeting on racial justice, right, or equity or healing, right? And they have a history of being a racist themselves, right?
Absolutely.
So
that's common. That's common.
This is very common, right? And so again, and the agenda or the mindset, right, of some who, again, some mean well, but before you can really go out and try to help to heal to the capacity that you might like to, right, or the capacity that you may be able to, you got to do some deep searching in the mirror. Also, and in the article, one of the articles that was sent to us that we read, be willing to listen more. Again, same meetings, probably one too many, where someone is, I didn't know, or they all, they hurt. Again, we're talking about somebody's reality. Again, I get to be a sociology professor. I get to talk about racial profiling. Today, we did, I showed high schoolers who are dual enrolled, right, and a bunch of college student videos on the privilege walk, right? And I know we'll get to white privilege and what that means and what that looks like. But as we constantly, right, and many are constantly, eyes are coming open. That's a wonderful thing as their eyes come open, but don't think, again, because your eyes are open and you can see certain things, that you see the whole picture, all right? Last thing I'll add to this as we think about this idea of social justice racism, what issues, right, are given attention to? What issues are really given the resources, that are given the press, right, that are given, oh, this is what's important now. And again, the people who get to decide that are the people who are in power. So for those who are in power or position, right, or authority and privilege and all, that really seriously want to be a friend, right, a real supporter, right, not just a person that groups will take the resources, right, and smile and nod, right, and kind of play the game, right. But as far as us getting to the place that I think we can get to, right, which is a better place, we got to do a lot of the internal work, right. So those are some of my thoughts.
It is funny, Brother Fred. I hope you don't get fired because of me. But y'all who saw me at University of Wyoming know that I'm a truth teller. And in truth telling, we will have collective healing. But to say someone is a social justice racist or participating in social justice racism is actually a paradox. Because if you're white in America, you are a racist. I don't care if you're a white supremacist racist. I don't care if you're a social justice person. You're a racist. I mean, it's really, really difficult to basically live and live a long life in this country and not be socialized into white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, capitalism. And that's not just for white people, right? And so I think that, you know, to be fair to the racists who claim to be social justice advocates, they have to understand, as Sister Faith was saying, it's a spectrum to this game. And we're talking about a nation that was built on horror, a nation that was built on annihilation. And I always try to remind people, even when I was at the University of Wyoming, keep in mind that the Europeans, they set out on a quest for world domination.
Manifest destiny.
Psychological, it's economical, right? It's built in our infrastructures, our entire geographies. Those of us from Chicago, from Illinois, we know it's built in our roadways. And that's not just here. Even some of our campuses looks like plantations, right? And so we really, all of us on the quest, if we're really, if we really, really want to combat racial injustice or white supremacy capitalism, that means that we first have to decolonize our minds. So if we're going to talk about a racial consciousness, we also have to talk about the effects and the processes of psychological warfare. Nobody wants to have that conversation. You opened up with it, but we don't know how to have it because even some of us here, we are complicit and we're implicated in this intersection of racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and xenophobia. Some people here ain't gonna speak truth to power because they looking for their next paycheck.
Absolutely.
Now I do want y'all to pay me. I'm just kidding, but they're looking for their next paycheck.
You see what I'm saying? Last time.
Y'all still get y'all residual.
I'm just saying, at this point, you know where I'm from. I'm from 79th Street. One hand wash the other.
I got you. But you see what I'm saying? And so some of us, we're invested and we're complicit in this. Now, some of us are going to dare to step outside of it, right? Some of us are going to dare to step outside of it. But if we're going to do exactly what Faith is saying, which is to challenge ourselves collectively, individually, and as people who are part of a community, right? We now have to start talking about what does it mean to heal from the psychological and the corporal and the civic welfare warfare that has been basically written in stone against our very presence here in this country, in North America.
The wilderness of North America. Some call it the hells of North America. Todd, if we could go right into social justice racism and your thoughts on that.
Commercialization of a race.
Okay.
They've already pretty much summed it up, but in any manner that you can look at it, from the institution of slavery, from the
yes, sir.
Yeah, from the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex. It's a lot of complexes and complexities that need to be broken down. And going back to what Dr. Venus has said, it starts with us. The decolonized mind are ones that have fought that good fight, have been knocked down and got back up and still in the fight. And so I'm not speaking from a platform from present day. I was a practitioner maybe 10 to 15 years ago when it wasn't very popular. And it was in a fight, indeed it was. And so to advocate for all, but with my staunch advocacy for all, where I got the most pushback at is when it came to speaking truth to the power about how this is not benefiting us. And so when we start talking about social justice, racism, it's still a social construct, just like race in and of itself is.
Yes,
and so when we talk about white here in America, it's like what Malcolm X said, white means boss. Because before, there was a time when Irish people weren't white. There was a time when Italian people were white, Polish people were white, but they experienced their immigration and integration into this nation in a different manner than what we have. And so it's not so much as I try to not to talk as much as what I do. And so I can tell by this panel that we are a panel of doers. And so I say, keep up the great work. There are some of us who can speak so eloquently about what needs to be done, to whereas people in society need that type of guidance. But again, going back to what Dr. Venus said, I think the other thing is that what they're afraid of, and what the society at large is afraid of, is that what may happen if they don't straighten it out. And they've had prime examples of that, whether it be the insurgents at the White House. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. Okay.
And again, if we're looking at powers, I mean, we still have a civil war in the United States of America right now. Because to be honest with you, what took place at the White House had very little to do with us. Okay. So,
And to that point, Todd, if I might jump in and play a little double dutch here.
No, good.
You know, because I see some of the questions that are coming through the chat, and I want the questions to keep coming. I think that sometimes too, you know, we think about the insurrection, we always have this, and the people who are killing Black people, like we see Ma'Khia Bryant was killed by a white male police officer, right? And we can go on and on to so many killings of Black boys and Black girls and Black women and men. But I think sometimes white women don't see their role in this genocidal, you know, Holocaust against people of African ancestry. They always assume that they are just naturally compassionate. They're just naturally allies. And the truth is, whether you're doing DEI work, if you're in a K-12 system, if you're in higher education, sometimes our biggest threats is actually that young white woman. Countries have went to war for white women's tears. Let's be realistic. And so
Helen of Troy.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying?
I
and
do.
So I think we have to have honest conversations about not just toxic white masculinity, but also if there's such a thing as racial microaggressions, there's something called white racial passivity that does just as much harm
Absolutely.
to Black people, especially in these institutions, than, you know, this toxic, you know, white male patriarchy. So I really do want to talk about that, because we're not talking about who these so-called social justice educators, racists are.
Well, let's go on that lens and continue to move and look at it in a way that's practical. So to think about it in a practical setting, here at the University of Wyoming, we have folks over Social Justice Research Center that's funded extremely well. We have a group that's called Martin Luther King Days of Dialogue. And it's becoming, you know, moving to the point where, you know, literally these folks over Martin Luther King Days of Dialogue have for years hitched their wagons onto Dr. King and become the leaders in his legacy assassination. And it's okay. So it's the passivity of the folks who send the ball and then the ones who carry the ball. So this is in concert. You can't separate it. You can't push it apart, but they work in concert. Now I want to go to Ben and tell you guys this story. Ben and I, Ben brought me out with ACEs to do a professional development on advising Black male students. And as usual, when the question and answers come, as the conversation was flowing fairly well, and Ben asked the question, and I came back and asked Ben a question. I asked Ben, what was his thoughts, or how did he feel about reparations for Blacks from the transatlantic slave trade? And Ben answered unequivocally, it should happen. Now, when we think about those things that we see in public, I've seen Ben work his number or become part of the fray outside of a public venue, meaning we have organized together. But there is a huge way of watering down some of the things that these folks in positions of power say in public, and then the things that they fund, and then the things that they do not fund. So when we think about that, let us go to a few of these questions right now. But Ben, we were going to ask you your thoughts about social justice racism before we go to our questions, and we're going to begin them now.
Yeah, and I appreciate Dr. Venus, you bringing in the idea of capital and capitalism, and that ties directly to what Dr. Dixon just said, right? Who holds the purse strings, and what are they willing to fund, and what are they not willing to fund? And it all ties back, right, with this idea of whites wanting to feel good about themselves. I'm feeling good about what I'm doing, but they're not willing to maybe make any sacrifices. They're not willing to give up the privilege or the power, be it monetary power or be it a position of authority over somebody else. And so I think that's the capital aspect has to be brought into play, and just people aren't willing to give it up. They're not willing to give that. They've grown accustomed to this lifestyle, this thing, and they don't want to give it up. They don't want to consider themselves to be racist, but they don't want to give up anything that it's provided to them. And the other thoughts I had was just, Dr. Perry, you mentioned self-reflection, and these folks have to do the work and put in the time. And I think it's got to go beyond self-reflection. You can't just go on a journey walk out into the wilderness and discover this stuff. It might help, but I think you've got to do the real hard work about learning the history. And because as a white man, you're not taught this stuff in school. You have to go out and seek it from scholars who have really written well on the subject about, the Chinese Exclusion Act. What was it? They don't really teach that in schools, right? And so really do the work to find out what history has been left out. What powers and privileges have I been granted that maybe I don't even know about? And so, that's where it's coming from. People are, and the other thing is that social justice has been politicized, as unfortunately many things have been politicized right now. Public health, all sorts of other things have been politicized. And so it's, what side of the binary are you on? And so folks say, oh, well, I'm on this blue side, this liberal side. And so I'm for social justice. And when it comes down to you have to give some things up. And, oh, I didn't agree to that. Right. And so I think there's a lot of stuff going on there, but the politicization of it kind of creates this idea of social justice racism, because it's which side are you on? Not that this is an insanely multifaceted issue. And so, capital, white ignorance, and which side of the line do you fall on?
Well, Ben,
And it's been commodified, right, Ben? So if we think about our teacher education programs, right, they're like incentivizing these young white women to go into urban education or education with
there's a
racial
dollar value
minority,
that goes to that
ESL,
that they can
ELL.
capitalize on. It's a
Yeah, we
dollar
see
value.
growth in DEI work. Yeah, so it's being incentivized. Yeah, it's commodified. The movement is commodified.
And that is prompted by a deficit mindset. So within the capitalistic structure, it's very much about a deficit mindset. So no one wants to relinquish their assumed power, regardless of, and that is subjective, how much power and resources that they have. And so if we are stuck in that, we bought into a system that there isn't enough, I am not going to face my own internal challenges around my privilege and my fragility, because then I just want to hold on to what I think I have. And I want to double back to what Dr. Winters was talking about in terms of truth telling. And I want to add a little something to it. Truth telling is very different from truth and reconciliation. And before anybody can get to truth and reconciliation, you have to move through. If you're going to do truth and reconciliation, do it with your own folks. Do it with all your cousins and them, right? Where you're able to have the hard conversations that Ben is talking about, because you have to do it. You have to challenge yourselves. You have to find the resources in which you are able to do the kind of truth and reconciliation within yourselves. And that in and of itself begins the action of truth telling to your other peers and colleagues. And then you can have a conversation with me. Because in some of what and I'm not saying it happens in all of my community, right? But in many of my community, in one way or another, we do have these moments in which we are doing truth telling for ourselves. So it is incumbent upon our white peers to also be able to do the hard work themselves, go caucus amongst yourself, to come back to have a more robust conversation. That also shifts the dynamics of power, where you're no longer being patriarchal and saying, I'm going to control this conversation. You're going to then have to meet us in a space where there is a more level table.
Okay, here we go with a question. What role do white perspectives on capitalism play for Black social justice movements in the future? Where do those perspectives need to be? Anybody, feel free, jump right in. You guys want me to read it again? Okay. What role do white perspectives on capitalism play for Black social justice movements in the future? Where do those perspectives need to be?
Well, I would just interject the white perspectives on capitalism. There's a spectrum there, right? Like, I mean, however, I would also say that all of us in this country are capitalists in some way, shape, or form, right? No matter what we claim. I heard people say we're waiting on our paycheck, and it's just ingrained in our society. You cannot exist without existing in that system. However, there's a spectrum of the value you put in that system.
Okay. I've been intentionally supporting Black-owned businesses in my endeavor to become an ally. Given the many valid arguments against racism being tied up in a direct product of, this says, communism, do the panelists consider supporting Black-owned businesses a valid act? Perry, what you thinking, bro?
It's the word valid. I think it's a right act. It's a righteous act, right? Again, as we try to move forward, right, and as we try to move forward in the right direction with understanding what this thing is all about, I'm gonna comment on something else, semi-related. Even the notion of Black Lives Matter. Okay, again, we have so many around the globe, okay, around the globe that are standing up. They got the sign out, right? They got the sign up. We support, and
they control the committees.
Absolutely, right. But I want to talk about the audacity, even of this idea, right? That when a group has to affirm their very existence, okay? We're not talking about going to college, getting into higher education, that matters. But just being alive actually matters, right? For a whole group, population of folk. I just want someone to allow that to resonate, okay? All right, with that being said, going back to the question about supporting Black businesses, absolutely. I think that it's a bridge and it's an opportunity perhaps to connect with someone and some people, right, from a culture that maybe all you heard was the foolishness in the media, right, or the propaganda, right? As right now, again, we're in the season, right, that this is the trend of the hour, okay? But guess what? Oh, it's going to change. So yeah, that's my comment to that. Absolutely.
Well, how about this? I'll put it on the table in a very direct and specific way. If you go into this Black shop to spend your money, and the first thing you think about is how, as someone mentioned, from the deficit model that you're doing your job to massage your own thoughts and your own ego just by being there, then that goes to the psycho viscera of social justice races. See, there's a common thought amongst a critical mass of whites, particularly professionals, that Blacks need white advice to be sustained in any system, particularly higher education. Boy, if you understood the stuff that happens in inclusivity pillar committee meetings, how we see these folks that are clicked up. Now, I need to talk about this because we haven't talked about it yet, the failure of the Negro intellectual and what role they play in these things that we call social justice racism, because it doesn't happen without the bourgeois Negro. It doesn't happen with the failure of their mindset. It doesn't happen with their love and the way they look to this iconic whiteness. So in deep thought, when we think about this, none of these things can be separated. They all work in concert. So I wanted to think about how we have these conversations, because there are many folks, particularly on this campus, that are upset that we're even having this conversation. Furthermore, the kickback and the blowback from this will be very sequestered. You know, it's like a team huddling up, and they will get together and come out of that huddle with a play. But the bottom line is with this is nothing new. This is what your fathers did. This is what your grandfathers did. This is what you've been taught. So to think about the role that the failure of the Negro intellectual plays, well, we have folks who have positions of authority with DEI and our ball carriers. And when you see that, and I'm going to sound very Southern right now, when you see them scratching with no itch, when you see them dancing with no music, these are things that we are so used to in the Black community that separates us from our Black professionals. So Bobby Wright, Dr. Bobby E. Wright, first Black graduated with PhD psychology from University of Chicago in 1955. He calls it menticide, where you think your friend is your enemy and your enemy is your friend. Put that in the chat, Toby, menticide by Dr. Bobby E. Wright. So Todd, if you could continue this conversation, and I know we've had many of these different conversations and we've been tangential about them, but if you could go back to just some of these things that make the layered nuances, those things that we don't pay much attention to them, like when folks say microaggressions. They're not micro.
I think I'm coming from a different standpoint because I don't think a lot about what whites can do to help us as much as I think about what we can do. And so it's clearly demonstrated by the panelists that we like-minded in that respect. And so I've rode that boat already. And so as a growing optimist, I try to look at things from a standpoint of what we can actually do, because we have so many people who can speak eloquently as to what's taking place in the past. But what I'm really interested in, and maybe just pointing out, is that, you know, there's something that we can all do. I mean, for us to tell them or expect for them to all of a sudden, after centuries of oppression, just decide that they want to break bread with us right now, I think we barking up the wrong tree, and pardon my cliches. And so I don't want to differ, or I don't want to, I don't want to be at variance with what's being said, because I agree with what everyone said wholeheartedly, but I'm just looking at it from a different view. And my experience in that particular space was quite different, and from the standpoint that, for example, Dr. Perry, if he had the opportunity to work with Jerry Weber, Dr. Weber, he was a white male. He was a president of Kankakee College, and then, you know, he called me in his office. So I can also see where some people who try and then they get their hands slapped because they may say the wrong thing, or because they don't truly understand. And so, I mean, there's opportunity for all of us to grow in this particular room. I've heard that that's the largest room in the world, you know, the room for improvement. And so from where I stand right now, I agree again, but I really don't want to point out and try to educate whites on what they should be doing to validate our movement. And because, again, when I talked about commercialization, I mean, when we're looking at $8 billion that's been invested in the D&I, and we know that D&I is mainly about risk management. I mean, we could talk about, you know, the committees which I've been on, you know, and all of these range of things. But it means, if you look at it for what it really is, George Floyd, I accommodate Emmett Till, that changed a lot of things. That changed the way, it changed the paradigm in this whole society, from working in a virtual environment to us all being at risk, as if we didn't realize that in the first place, coming from the minus canary. And so a lot of things that people are doing to try to undermine our progress, our growth, I mean, it's like they're really, they contributing to their own demise, because it's not benefiting them. And so now we're not on plantations, but now, as they said, Facebook and all these other monstrosities, these institutions are capitalizing on our plight. And they're actually interfering based on the way it's been promoted in the media. And so, for example, if we're talking about our Jewish brothers, we look at how they used to demean them by the characters and the way that they portrayed them in the media. That went away. So they don't have that to continue with. It didn't completely go away, but what I'm saying is that's not prevalent in society right now. And then we say, stop, you know, we want to protect them. We have a campaign talking about stop the hate against AAPI population. And then we have George Floyd, and then we have Breonna Taylor, and then we have Mike Brown, and then we have Tamir Rice, and we have so many. So what do we expect? I mean, I know that this will be enlightening for enlightened people, but I think the brothers and the sisters and the allies in the street have had their say. I mean, if you look at who stood on the sidewalk, they were allies. You had a child, you had a white woman who was a paramedic, you had an African-American male who was a MMA fighter. I mean, and they said they interfered when they tried to intervene. When we say George Floyd died or he was murdered, he was lynched. Let's be real. Let's move away from those euphemisms and tell it like it is. Truth tellers, tell it like it is. And so there's a lot of people who don't want to hear it. And there's some people, I mean, it's an eye-opening experience for them. And so, I mean, we're going to try to teach who we can reach. And so that's what I'm interested in. But I'm more interested in what I've learned from sitting on this panel, from listening from these different perspectives, because I've definitely myself has been enlightened. And so, again, I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. So we got a couple more. One says, how does one, not in position of power, deconstruct infrastructure and policies that have been built on white supremacy?
So I just want to jump in and say one thing that's kind of related to that, but it certainly piggybacks on what Todd just said. Teach who you can reach. And I think for all the white people on the call who want to be allies, you can reach other white people, right? So you can talk to other white people about whiteness and about the impact that it has and about racist policies and infrastructure. And so that's an impact that you can have. And that's the impact that might not make you feel very good, right? Because those are going to be uncomfortable conversations. And in fact, you might lose some friends, but that's teach who you can reach. That's who you can reach as a white person.
That's a very difficult conversation to have at the dinner table with your family. It's also a difficult conversation to have with your local pastor. It's also difficult to have with your best friend. It's also difficult to have with your supervisor. And it's also difficult to have with yourself. So my question is, well, it's not a question, I'm gonna read this straight from, it says, this is Dr. Venus, an important aspect of healing is truth telling. So if that's one of the very first steps, Dr. Venus, is truth telling, then before we can get to atonement and forgiveness, we need to get to recognition. So your thoughts on that, Dr. Venus?
Yeah, I was just thinking it. So listening to Todd and Ben, it's true. I mean, so what's happening is that sometimes even when I speak in the way that I speak, because I speak from the front porch, people can easily feel like I'm hurting their feelings. I'm not nice enough. They can feel intimidated. But the truth is, if you want to learn anything, go study Black women. Go study Black women. That's, you know, because even I was thinking about this whole idea of social justice, racism is performative. It's performative wokeness. And that's something else that we're combating. And I think Faith said it early. So when I speak and when I'm speaking the truth, it will penetrate here, not just here. And when you talk about racial microaggressions and you talk about this opposing aspect of it, you're also talking about macro passivity. And anybody in the field of mental health, we know what happens when we talk about passive aggression as another form of violence, right? And so we also have to begin to encourage, well, not we, I'm like Todd, I got to work with my own son and daughter, right? But some of our so-called white co-conspirators, white teachers, right? We need to really build up the stamina of white people to sit in your fucking discomfort. I'm going to cuss. That doesn't mean that when I jump out my car that I'm going to shoot you 4 times at point blank. That's not going to be me. You see what I'm saying? And so even like when you watch the Ma'Khia Bryant killing, right? Yep. I see myself from all angles. I've been in a state of killing rage where I wanted to use a form of weaponry, whether that was a gun or a knife. I have not been the girl on the ground, but I do know people who was getting kicked in the fucking head by a grown ass man as a Black girl. And I know Black girls who have wielded knives to get at another girl. I work with youth in care. So I know what her body is holding on to. I know what it's like the other girl who was being aggressed on that day. I know what it's like to feel vulnerable and that you need protection. I know what it's like for the older women sitting in the background screaming, somebody help us, don't hurt them, can somebody break this up? What I don't understand is a man jumping out like he's in the middle of Warcraft or whatever these damn shooting games are, PlayStation 2. You see what I'm saying? That he didn't even think. That's what I can't understand. So if we're going to heal in this country, you know what? Go vote for a Black woman. Go to a Black woman healer. Go read a Black woman. Go read the work of Septima P. Clark. Go read the work of Polly Murray if you're in education. Go read the work of Fannie Lou Hamer. You see what I'm saying? Go read the work of Shirley Chisholm, because that's what's going to free and heal this country. You see what I'm saying? Because right now we're only headed one way in one direction, and that's hell.
How about this, Sister Vena?
State now or purgatory, to be clear.
How about this, Sister Vena? I think when he jumped out of that car, he didn't have to think. His muscle memory took over. He was dealing with another subgroup of dehumanized kind of humans, or what did they say, 3/5 of a person? That's at the very best. Go ahead, Todd.
I'm just saying that's what they expect for you to do when you jump out of that car. They expect for you, And then on the flip side, when you have someone who held people hostage, killed a person or two, they still were able to take them and subdue them and take them, at least they lived. They went.
And Todd, you know what power is, Todd? Because I love the way that you talk. And you know what power is. Not only did he treat her like she was a weapon of mass destruction, because that's what he's been trained to do. I'm more interested in the system that created him. I'm not interested in him or Siobhan. Yes, do I want them to be held accountable? Of course I do. But I'm interested in the system that created him, that created the girl who was on the defense, who created the boys who was watching. Because guess what? And we see this in classrooms every day. Why didn't the men folk jump his ass? You see what I'm saying? So
Absolutely.
we all need
Absolutely.
to heal. We're all living in traumatic bodies.
Absolutely.
All
if
of
you're not
us.
willing to die for Black women, then that's the result.
All of us. And I'm not saying that brothers are responsible for putting themselves in harm's way, but I'm interested in systems that have created these passive bodies and these bodies that just reacting without thinking. They're both equally dangerous.
I think we got one more here we can cover, you all, because I think that where we are right now is exactly where we need to be. Should conversations about white allyship speak to issues involving white supremacy, patriarchy, and social economic status?
Yes. Full
Go
stop.
ahead, Faith, please. Feel free.
Yes. Full stop. Like, I mean, that is the moment you start to get into the muck and the mire.
I didn't say, Sister Faith, that there's another part to this, but go ahead.
Yeah, I saw that question, but it's a two-part, right? Like,
yeah, it's two-part,
right? And that first question is big enough. Like, just start there.
Absolutely.
Right? Because the moment you decide to begin to wrestle with it, right? Every religion has a way in which the spirit, the body has to figure out how they wrestle with these challenges. The moment you begin to wrestle with it, you begin to recognize the immensity of it. And that in and of itself is going to take some time. That in and of itself is the work. Full stop.
So,
yeah, and I'll jump in too and say absolutely yes. And that's a reservation I think that a lot of white folks have, is that they don't want to talk about race and they don't want to talk about whiteness because they'll think that it's perceived as supporting white supremacy in some fashion or form. But it's got to start, and then you start to see, and then you start to evolve and go through the process. And I think anybody who, I guess, to the person who posed that question, and anybody who can relate to that question, I would encourage you to look into Dr. Janet Helms's work on white identity development. She speaks very, very much to that. And so go and look at her work, and I think that will help.
All right, coming to you, Perry. Also, by centering discussions on white allyship, are we giving more voice and energy to white supremacy and not giving a much needed voice to the greatness of Black people and communities?
Repeat that again for me, brother, if you would.
You got it. Also, this was part 2 of that question, P. By centering discussions on white allyship, are we giving more voice and energy to white supremacy and not giving a much needed voice to the greatness of Black people and communities?
No, absolutely not. We probably need to be talking about, again, white supremacy. Again, I made reference to speaking with my high schoolers, right? And I'm grateful because at 16, 17, they having these conversations that many
Absolutely.
at 50, 60, 70,
I've been witness to it.
are not having, right? And so hopefully, again, by the time they get to our place, right, it's a whole different situation, at least for them. So absolutely not. Again, that is just a critical component of that whole conversation that needs to be had and how it needs to be had.
Todd, how about that argument? By sending discussions on white allyship, are we giving more voice and energy to white supremacy?
Well, I think our attempt is to bring it to, just enlighten others. I don't think it's adding more, not from the standpoint of from where the panelists are coming from, but I can see that, again, being commercialized in ways that people can capitalize on it. And so, I mean, it just depends. I mean, $8 billion, they can slice that, and that's just probably in the corporate world. They don't have anything to do with the other commercialization. And so on one hand, I can say yeah, and then on another, I said it's a much needed discussion that needs to take place. And you have the people here in the panel that has done such a great job at deconstructing it. So,
well, when I think about how monolithic and monochromatic this space is, to have this conversation here is really stepping into unprecedented spaces.
Okay.
We know that the idea of what we're discussing in itself is problematic, but there is so much room here and so much coverage, and that's ubiquitous around the country and the globe, to not have these conversations, whether it be for the fear of having someone look to you in a way that's negative, or just in the idea of having these conversations, because there are some folks that we need to have this conversation. There are other folks that say, well, this conversation may be divisive. And there's other folks that are listening to this conversation. Who the hell do you think you are having this conversation? So to think about it in at least a tri-patriot kind of institutional systematic racism, then having this conversation is indeed uncomfortable in the public for those who are guilty. So it's just like the old term of throwing that rock and seeing who's gonna yell. So to think about that, those folks that I know that I work with deeply are only upset because we're having this conversation in public, which means eventually I'm going to point that particular camera at them. Yeah, Social Justice Research Center, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, they're guilty.
Well, hopefully we can decolonize their minds, or at least we're making a valiant effort.
That's the goal. We need to have solutions. That's the goal, Todd. It's not the fact that we sit here with this ultimate goal of embarrassing people, but if the truth is embarrassing, then you're very comfortable with a lie.
Well, we're not selling the panacea.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So as we wrap up, you all, been a great discussion. Can't thank you all enough. Closing thoughts. I would say ladies first, but if you ladies will go with me, I would like for you ladies to close it down. So Ben, feel free.
Yeah, I just think it's great that we're having this conversation. I mean, the program that Dr. Dixon and I put on, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and so I think it just needs to keep going. And the other thing is that the feedback was like, okay, this is great talking about it. What can we put into action? And I think that's a question for a lot of people, right? Is what can we do? But I think they need to listen to this, right? Because they can then maybe think, well, what does that action look like? And is that action in the frame of social justice racism? Because we can very easily, okay, let's go do this thing. But I think you have to look at it with a critical perspective to make sure, what are you pushing? What are you doing? What are you bringing awareness to? And so that's my closing thought.
Tiffany sent us something that said, how about forcing a true examination of white pathology? Well, this is a great start, but I agree with her. Dr. Bobby E. Wright again, psychopathic racial personality. Please put that in, Toby. Dr. Bobby E. Wright, the psychopathic racial personality. I think it's speaking directly to what you're saying, Tiffany, but I agree. It needs to be discussed. So that takes us to Todd. Why don't you go next and give us your closing thoughts?
Well, my closing thoughts are honored to be here. I appreciate being uplifted and enlightened by the distinguished panelists. And just in case they didn't know that you come from a heritage of not only freedom fighters, but historian. And it's, and your father, one of my mentors, the Honorable Willie Dixon, he served.
Learn behaviors, brother.
Amen. So with all of that being said, I commend you on doing such a great job of putting this panel together and allowing each of us to share our thoughts and our ideas about what we can do to make some improvements in that particular area. And so to that, I say,
well, it goes back and forth with you and I. We come through some of these same traditions that have shaped us greatly. So I thank you for always saying yes and always being on point. And lots of times your voice is a very challenging voice in many ways. So I do thank you too, dear brother. Dr. Perry, my dear brother, thank you for coming and give us your thoughts.
Absolutely. And thank you, brother, for the opportunity to share. A couple of closing thoughts. One, for those who seek to support, right, who have the right intention, again, have a good intention, the right intention. The first comment I made was sitting in meetings with people who are in charge or leading meetings, but it's some things that they're clearly missing. Also, something I want to add, those same people, they do have some Black people around them, right, that have in their own way validated. What I want to encourage those groups to do is extend that circle, right, and go and talk to Austin. Email Dr. Venus Evans Winters, okay, and then ask her, okay, because sometimes, again, you can always find 2 or 3 people to oh yeah, that sounds good, that looks good, oh, this tastes good. Well, that's really not the case, okay? Number 2, as we think about this idea of the system, this is what we're in. This is the issue, right? Again, as we touch on it, as we speak to it, we have plenty of work to do. Again, I think that we can get to a place, again, as we look in the mirror first, start right there and keep on doing the work. God bless everyone who's doing the work, and God bless all those who have a sincere desire to do this work. Thank you all for your time.
All right, Sister Faith, I appreciate you. You know I do.
I appreciate the invite. This has been a great way to end a Wednesday, because it's almost 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. So thank you.
And the Knicks are on, right?
I mean, listen. I'm gonna let that ride. But now, the work of being anti-racist, the work of assuming to be, to remove yourself from being an anti-Black racist, I hope I got the negatives correct, is hard work. And those are 2 different things, being anti-racist and being anti-Black racist, right? Because there are some key fundamental things, differences between the 2. And oftentimes the challenge can be how to level up to become anti-Black racist. The work is continuous, it never ends, and be generous with yourself to move through it with fearlessness and grace, because it is hard work. It does not stop for anybody. It doesn't stop for the Black intellectuals who have bought into a system. It doesn't stop even for me, and I try to live this out every day of my life. It will not stop for all of you who are doing this work. So ultimately, the other resource I want to share is Being Black, Zen and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace. That is Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. And if you take nothing else from that, it is, what does it mean to step into the hard work with fearlessness and offer yourself the grace, because you're gonna mess up. Being an ally is gonna be hard, and you're gonna mess up and get up and keep doing the work, because if you don't, then it's just lip service.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That leads my dear sister, Dr. Venus.
So, I aspire to be where Todd is. So first of all, look, y'all.
Hey, me too.
I'm fierce. And I'm fierce. And that's why my goal is to be a somatic abolitionist. Because I'm at the point that I've actually lost hope in white people, collectively speaking. I've lost hope. And I'm at a point in my life, in my career, in my growth in this human experience that I can admit that. However, I do have hope for people of African ancestry, indigenous people, and many of our youth of color. They keep getting, every time we get hit, they just rise back up. But we really have to give attention to white socialization. White people have to do the work with white people.
Yes.
Black people, we have to end this career of trying to convince white people collectively to act more humane. So if we're talking about 400 or 500 years of oppression and colonization and apartheid, we're talking about 400 or 500 years of people who have been taught and conditioned that they are superior. And it's white superior, it's white body supremacy that's killing all of us. And so it's going to have to be young white people who have to step up and decide, I do not want to be complicit in the annihilation, not only of human beings, but of plant life and animal life. We can't keep going on like this because white people aren't even experiencing true freedom. And I know that because you have to leave this country to understand what freedom is, what true freedom is. And as long as you got your knee or hands wrapped around another person's neck, if your neighbor is not free, you're not truly free. You're actually living to keep them down. So white people have to do the work with white people. White people have to conscientiously understand white supremacy as a psychology, as an economic structure, and even a curriculum. And we have to get to Black people, Indigenous people, people of African ancestry, we have to get back to the healing work. So we have two different, we have one goal, which is humanity, but we also have different agendas at this point.
Well,
as we should. I mean, simply because everybody, and it sounds like another cliche, you know, no one can do everything, but everybody can do something. And so at some point, I mean, we have to have a balance, you know, because we're talking about menticide and genocide. I mean, we have to have a balance, and this is a continuum. When we're talking about continuity, and we know with all the great ideas and the great minds, you can take them all from the Ivy League institutions, from the most well-educated Negro we can find in this country, and Dr. Dixon is one of them. But you're not going to solve this problem in a conversation, and we got to begin to move beyond the conversation to solving the problems. And so for me, I mean, I don't mean to be offensive again, and I am a hard person, a challenging person to have certain conversations with, because I don't just look at it from a standpoint of I and me. I know that our people would have, well, part of my people have been annihilated. I mean, there are reservations and nations that no longer exist that people refer to as Indians. And so it's. And
you're right, Mr. Todd, because I saw too in the chat, somebody put, how could University of Wyoming do this work and we're not diverse? You're on indigenous land, people. I've been to y'all campus. Right. Y'all have indigenous people who are still alive that you're treating like they don't exist.
Right. Don't exist. Right.
Absolutely. As a mindset, I mean, they always talk about it this way. One's attitude is orientation into their mind. So to speak to Sister Faith, anti-Blackness is the organizing principle of America's caste system. You're absolutely right. And then I think about it in a way when we talk about racism and social justice racism, there is very little, if none, as we know it collectively, some moral correctness that finds itself in DEI, in social justice racism, as well as in higher education. So to think about that, to think about what true social justice is, it would create on-ramps and pathways that with counterweights and narratives against the rule of mediocrity, forms of dogmatism, and conformity to American status quo. And we are not there. So I want to thank each and every one of you all. And I think this is always not enough. Absolutely. There's absolutely no way we're going to talk our way out of this trick bag. And furthermore, when we think about those who are white allies, one thing that you're going to have to do is deal directly with, if you are a true ally, being able to take orders from somebody you think you're smarter than. Now that's a practical piece. That's a practice, because that goes to your psychovisceral and your mindset about Negroes and Blacks needing to be told what to do by whites. So that deals with it directly. And when we think about, you know, the systemic racism, so how we are able to say to ourselves that it's okay for a person of color to lead to a person who is a European, a Caucasian that says they should be over Black Lives Matter. See, the failure of the Negro intellectual, we discussed it, but not as much as we should. And only time will allow. But what I will say is that I'm with you, Dr. Venus. As a cynic by trade, there is something about me that still has hope. And it does not have hope for how I've been trained as a cynic. It has hope for the idea of the raising of the whole of humanity to a baseline of understanding that we no longer have right now. And I think you're absolutely right. The whiteness is killing not just this country, but this entire planet. And I do believe that if we believe in anything that happened in the Old Testament, because you know we're not supposed to talk about religion and statehood at the same time. But there was a time where a flood came through and erased a whole lot of stuff. I think we line up pretty well with some of those same concepts that are going on right now in our community. But for everybody who's at home and everybody who joined us, we thank you. We thank you for the questions. We thank you for being here. We thank you for chasing this title that you lined up here to see exactly what we were going to say. And the idea was to extend the mainstream narrative. And I rest assured that we did. But we only began the conversation that needs to move to practical work. So again, for everybody, I thank my dear friend, Ben, for being a part of this. And I thank my man, Toby, for making sure that he held us down and we moved right along. But to all my panelists, you guys know that I can't thank you enough, but I'm only one phone call away, and I'm always very receptive and interested on paying back. Some say pay it forward. I just want to pay it back. So feel free. I love the fact that what Dr. Perry is doing in his classroom, they are having some serious conversations. I've been to his classroom. Now, what I really miss out of this is having my dear sister Venus in the academy, but she is showing me my way. So I thank you. Sister Faith, thank you so much. Todd, thank you so much. Ben, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much. And you guys hold on just for a second. I guess we can kill a recording right now. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Kenya.